Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we'll go into the dark parts of the Appalachian Mountains, where something happened in North Carolina that is beyond human understanding. The first rumors started to spread through the Appalachian Mountains' remote villages in 1894. At that time, North Carolina was a place with thick fog, dense forests, and towns that were so cut off from the outside world that they could go months without talking to anyone. The roads were dangerous. They were just dirt paths that wound their way between rocky peaks and deep valleys. Life was hard there because people had to work on small farms and cut down trees to feed the sawmills that were spread out across the area. People lived by their own rules, away from the law and the society that thrived in the coastal cities. People in the dusty taverns and on the porches of wooden houses started to talk about a family that lived in the highest and hardest-to-reach parts of the mountains. Nobody knew for sure when they got there or where they came from. Some people said they had been there for generations, hiding among the old oak and pine trees. Others said they just showed up out of nowhere, as if the forest itself had given birth to them. Everyone agreed that there was something very wrong with that family line. The first reports were vague, as if people were afraid to speak up in case someone was listening. People who traveled on the most remote trails told of strange things they saw: empty houses with strange markings on the walls, campfires that burned by themselves in the middle of the night, sounds that didn't belong to any known animal, and that feeling of being watched by invisible eyes in the shadows of the thick forest. The family never went down to the villages, never bought anything at the local stores, and never went to the many Baptist churches in the area. They were ghosts in the mountains, and the only time people talked about them was when they were sitting around the fire at night in the winter, when the nights were long and scary. But in 1894, something happened that would bring this secret family out of the shadows and reveal secrets that should have stayed hidden forever. A lumber dealer who worked for one of the county's big sawmills had to go to a new area farther north where the trees were old and valuable. He made a small base camp and started to map out the area. It was during one of these trips that he saw the first sign: an artificial clearing that had been cut into the forest in a way that made it look like there was nothing but untouched nature. There were buildings in the middle of this clearing that looked like homes, but they were built in a very basic, almost ugly way: logs stacked up without any clear purpose, roofs covered in branches and moss, and windows that were just dark holes in the wood. The merchant moved slowly. There was no smoke coming from the temporary chimneys, and there was no sound of life. He yelled, but all he heard back from the mountains around him was his own voice. When he finally worked up the nerve to look through one of the holes, he was shocked by what he saw: a dark room that smelled like something rotting and had marks on the walls that looked like they were made by hand, deep scratches in the wood that made no sense. He went back to the nearest town in Mitchell County and told the local police about what he had found. The man was doubtful because he was used to hearing exaggerated stories about workers who were scared of being alone in the mountains, but the trader's face showed real fear, which made him want to find out more. He got some men he could trust, and with rifles and lanterns in hand, they climbed the steep paths to the clearing. What they found that fall day would change how people saw that area forever. The family was there, but not in the way they thought they would be. They weren't criminals on the run or violent fugitives. They were something else, something that couldn't be explained. They lived in such a basic way that it seemed impossible to stay alive, without proper tools, domesticated animals, or any contact with the civilized world. When they finally did speak, their words were strange. They spoke a dialect that mixed Old English with something else that was hard to understand, as if they had made up their own language while living alone. But the worst part was still to come, because this dark story is only just beginning. The secrets of this family in the Appalachian Mountains would be revealed one by one, each one more disturbing than the last, creating a picture of mystery that is still impossible to understand. The police stayed in the clearing for hours, trying to figure out what they were seeing. The family didn't act hostile, but they also didn't explain anything. They just stared blankly at the visitors, as if they were watching beings from another world. It was hard to tell exactly how many people were there because the trees around them made the light so dim. There were about 12 people, maybe more. Their clothes had been patched so many times that it was hard to tell what kind of fabric they were made of. The sun and the cold wind at high altitudes had left their marks on their faces, making them look older than they were. The police officer tried to get in touch. He asked them their names, where they were from, and how long they had been there. The answers came slowly, in a strange dialect that mixed sounds that were familiar with ones that were completely new. One of the oldest men in the family, who seemed to be the head of the family, was able to communicate very little. He said they had always lived there and that the mountains had been their home since before anyone else could remember. He just shook his head when asked about records, papers, or any other proof that he was legally alive. There was nothing. No papers, no certificates, and no way to get in touch with the organized society that lived beyond those mountains. The discovery led to heated arguments in the county. How could a whole family live on the edges of everything? In 1895, state government officials climbed the trails to look into things more closely. They brought notebooks and pens with them to try to count the ghosts, but every question seemed to bring up more questions than answers. Unclear ages, mixed up family ties, and stories that didn't make sense. When asked about births, the family pointed to the forest, as if the mountains themselves were enough proof. There was only heavy silence when people were asked about deaths. The researchers saw something strange about the homes. There weren't any clear boundaries between the spaces, and it looked like everyone was living in the dangerous buildings without any privacy or order. There weren't many belongings, and they were almost non-existent. There were some rough wooden utensils, containers made of tree bark, and basic tools that looked like they had been made from stones and branches. There were no books, no valuables, and nothing else that would have shown a link to the outside world in that forgotten clearing. But what really bothered the visitors was the constant feeling that something was being kept from them. Family members looked at each other quickly, as if they were sharing secrets that couldn't be told. When investigators tried to look around the clearing, they were subtly told to stay away from some paths. There were places where the family clearly didn't want strangers to come near. There were trails that went into the thick woods and were marked with small signs that only they seemed to understand. Newspapers in North Carolina started to write about the find. Some publications were both fascinated and horrified by the case, which became known as the Lost Family of Appalachia. How could this happen in the 1800s, when the country was proud of how far it had come and how civilized it was? There were more and more theories. Some people thought they were the descendants of colonists who had cut themselves off from the rest of the world for very religious reasons generations ago. Others thought they were running away from some old tragedy and were hiding in the mountains to avoid being found. Some people even thought that the origins were even darker, linked to groups that did strange rituals away from the public eye. The government tried to take steps to help the family become part of society. They offered official land, helped build suitable houses, and gave access to schools for those who looked younger. But all offers were turned down with a silent and firm determination. They didn't want anything from the outside world. The mountains were their home, and they planned to stay there no matter what happened or what other people thought. In the months that followed, some brave people from the area tried to get in touch with them more. They brought food and tools and tried to teach the basics of farming and building. The family accepted the gifts with cold politeness, but they never gave anything back, showed any interest in learning, or said thank you. It was like they lived in a different world where the normal rules of life didn't apply. And then, people started to go missing. Not family members, but people who were visiting the area. At first, they were just a few cases that were easy to explain because the mountains were so dangerous. A hunter who didn't come back, a traveler who got lost. But the frequency went up, and there was always a disturbing pattern. All of them had been last seen near the family's home. The coincidences piled up in a way that couldn't be missed, creating an atmosphere of fear that spread through nearby communities like thick fog on cold mornings in the Appalachian Mountains. The people in charge of Mitchell County had a tough choice to make. There was no solid proof linking the family to the missing people, just a series of events that made it seem like something bad was going on. In 1896, the sheriff of the area put together a bigger expedition and brought along people from 3 nearby counties. The goal was to search the whole area thoroughly, map out the family's entire home, and look for any clues that might explain what happened to the people who went missing. The expedition left on a spring morning, when the snow had melted enough for the trails to be safe to walk on. There were 15 men in all, and they had enough food for a week. They climbed the steep hills, following trails that other groups had already made. When they got to the clearing, they saw the family just as they had before, living their strange, isolated lives and seeming to not care about the outside world. The sheriff told them why they were there. They needed to look for signs of the missing people in the areas around them. The head of the family listened in silence and then nodded as if to say yes. But there was something in his eyes that made him look too sure, as if he knew that no matter how deep the search went, nothing would be found. The men broke up into smaller groups and started looking in the woods. They found more buildings hidden among the trees, small huts that were not arranged in a straight line. Some looked like they hadn't been used in a long time, while others looked like they had just been used. Inside, the same simple things were there, but they were in a messy way. There was nothing that could be seen as evidence of a crime, like the missing men's things or any signs of violence or struggle. They saw marks all over the place, on trees, stones, and the ground that had been packed down. There were symbols that didn't fit with any known alphabet, and geometric patterns mixed with organic shapes, as if someone had tried to take something from nature and turn it into language. The men on the expedition wrote down some of these symbols in their notebooks so they could show them to scholars who could figure out what they meant. One of the deputies got too far away from the main group while they were looking. He walked down a narrow path that led into a deep valley where the thick trees blocked out most of the sunlight. He found something that made his blood run cold, a round area with no plants on it, where the ground had been beaten down until it was as hard as stone. In the middle, there were old campfire remains and ashes that looked like they had been there for decades. Around the circle, wooden stakes were driven into the ground, each with a strange symbol on it. When he told the others about what he had found, they were all immediately uncomfortable. It looked like a place for rituals, but no one wanted to say the word out loud. The sheriff thought they should get more information before making any decisions. They took pictures of the site with the simple cameras of the time and wrote down everything they saw. But when they tried to ask the family about it, they only got blank stares and stubborn silence. The expedition came back to the villages with more questions than answers. The copied symbols were sent to colleges and universities on the East Coast, where linguistics and anthropology professors tried but failed to figure them out. They didn't match up with any known native languages or any old European dialects. They were one of a kind, made or kept by that isolated family in the mountains. The code held secrets that might never be revealed. Over the next few months, there was more public pressure. The families of the missing people wanted action. They wanted the strange family taken out of the mountains and forced to live under supervision so they could be watched. But state lawyers said it would be hard to prove in court because there was no proof of a crime, only suspicions and coincidences. Taking people off their land without solid proof would be an abuse of power that could lead to more problems in the future. In 1897, a temporary fix was suggested. An outpost would be built close to where the family lived. Guards would always be on duty there, keeping an eye on people and keeping track of who came and went. The family wouldn't be bothered directly, but their privacy would be greatly reduced. The idea was that having authority around all the time would stop people from doing bad things and keep travelers from getting lost in those dangerous areas. The outpost was built on a hill that gave it a partial view of the main clearing. It was a simple but strong building that could comfortably fit 4 men. The first guards sent to the outpost were veterans who were used to being alone in the mountains and dealing with danger. They were told clearly to watch and report, but not to get involved unless they saw clear proof of a crime. The first reports were boring. Days went by without anything interesting happening. The family kept up their strange routine, walking through the woods in ways that looked random but probably made sense to them. Sometimes smoke came out of makeshift chimneys, and other times voices echoed through the trees, their strange dialect sounding like a distant lament. But then, on a moonless night in late fall, something happened that would change the investigation forever. The guards at the outpost said they saw strange lights moving through the woods. It wasn't the warm yellow of lanterns or torches. It was something else, almost greenish, that moved between the trees as if it were alive. And when the lights came on, there were sounds that didn't belong there, long melodies that made even the bravest men shiver. The guards stayed up all night watching the strange lights move around in the trees. None of them had the courage to leave their post and look into it more closely. The way the light seemed to float without following the natural patterns of fire or lantern was very wrong. When dawn finally came, the mountains were covered in thick fog that made the lights disappear completely, as if they had never been there. The sheriff got the report, but at first he didn't believe it. There were already strange lights in the mountains. They could be explained by things like reflections in rock crystals or gases coming up from the ground that made optical illusions. But when 3 of the 4 guards said they would leave their posts if they weren't taken seriously, the situation became much more serious. That same week, an investigation was set up. This time, there was a middle-aged man who was a professor of natural sciences at a university in Raleigh. He was known for being logical and using the scientific method. He came with cameras, measuring tools, and a thick notebook in which he planned to write down everything he saw. The local authorities felt better knowing he was there, as they hoped to finally get logical answers to the strange things that had been happening. The group got to the area in the afternoon and set up their outpost before nightfall. The professor spent the first few hours measuring the soil, collecting plant samples and looking at the rock formations. For a remote mountainous area of North Carolina, everything seemed perfectly normal. His instrument readings didn't show anything out of the ordinary, but he agreed to stay the night to see if the lights would come back on. They didn't have to wait long. The first signs of trouble started around 10 o'clock, when the forest was completely dark, just as the guards had said they would. There were greenish lights moving around the trees in a strange but purposeful way. The professor tried to take pictures of them, but all he got were blurry pictures that didn't show anything. His measuring tools didn't show any big changes or an energy source that could explain the bright lights. They watched the lights go around the forest for hours. At one point, they seemed to gather around the ritual circle that had been found weeks before. The professor told them to come closer so they could see better, but the guards flatly refused. There was something in the air that made everyone feel like they were in danger, even if they couldn't explain it logically. The air felt heavier, and the electrical tension in it made the hair on their arms stand on end. As the sun came up, the lights slowly faded away, blending in with the mist that was rising from the valleys. The professor was clearly upset. Something that he couldn't explain had shaken his scientific confidence. He said he didn't have any answers, just more questions. He said he would come back with better equipment, maybe even asking colleagues who studied rare atmospheric phenomena for help. But there was doubt in his voice, as if he knew that no equipment would be enough to solve this mystery. In the days that followed, people from nearby villages started to share their own stories. Farmers said that their animals were acting strangely, not wanting to graze in some places, and mooing nervously at night. Even experienced hunters who knew every inch of those mountains said they felt lost on trails they had walked hundreds of times. There were no known mineral deposits that could mess with magnetic instruments, but compasses kept spinning for no reason. Things got a lot worse in 1898. A group of religious people thought the problem was not physical, but spiritual. They put together their own trip, bringing Bibles, crucifixes, and holy water with them. They thought the family in the mountains was involved with dark forces and did rituals that let in things that should not be called. They sang hymns as they climbed the trails, ready to face what they thought was a sign of evil. The family treated them the same way they always do. They didn't seem scared of the religious symbols or angry that they were there. They just watched as the religious leaders walked through the camp, sprinkling holy water and reading Bible verses out loud. The patriarch looked at everything with an expression that could be seen as mild, almost amused curiosity. When the religious leaders finally left, tired and with no one reacting, it was clear that they had failed. But that night, something happened that no one could have seen coming. The religious men set up camp a few miles away and planned to come back the next day with more men. They woke up in the early morning hours to sounds coming from the clearing. They weren't the weird melodies that had been reported before. They were something else. They sounded like a lot of people singing in that strange language. The sound got louder and louder, bouncing off the mountains until it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. As quickly as the darkness would let them, the religious men packed up their things and hurried down the trails. 2 of them fell while going down and hurt themselves badly. They were in shock when they finally got to the nearest village at dawn. They promised never to go back to those mountains because they had felt something there that was beyond good and evil. It was something older and deeper, something that had been around in the shadows since before the first European settlers came to the continent. What happened that night changed how people saw the Appalachian family. What had once been seen as an interesting anthropological study of a small group living in a primitive way now felt much darker. The stories spread quickly, and with each telling they got more and more dramatic. People whispered about old curses and forbidden knowledge that was kept in the mountain's highest places in taverns and markets. People put pressure on the governor of North Carolina to do something. In 1899, he called a meeting with local leaders, police officers from different counties, and even soldiers from the state army. It was a tough situation. How to deal with people who technically hadn't done anything wrong but whose presence made a lot of people scared. The suggested solution was an uneasy compromise. The family would be watched all the time and closely, but they would not be forced to leave. The state would rather not deal with the legal and political problems that could come from trying to force people to move. The outpost was made bigger and stronger, and more guards were assigned to it, working in shifts to keep an eye on it all the time. They put in basic signaling systems, like mirrors placed in the right places to reflect sunlight and send quick messages to the villages in case of an emergency. It cost a lot of money for a rural county, but they thought it was necessary because the situation was so bad. The routine was set up for months. The guards kept daily logs of everything the family did and every movement they made. They found some interesting patterns. The family's activities seemed to follow the phases of the moon. During the new moon, they were almost invisible and rarely left their homes. But as the moon grew, they became more active, moving through the forest in small groups and doing things that the people watching couldn't fully understand. One of the guards who was paying close attention noticed something strange about the way the family was set up. He couldn't see any clear hierarchies other than the obvious father. It looked like everyone was able to share tasks easily, without any clear divisions of labor based on gender or age. There wasn't much interaction between them, almost as if they didn't need to talk to each other all the time and could understand each other in ways that other people couldn't see. Since the surveillance got stronger, the disappearances had stopped completely. This made the nearby towns feel better, but it also raised troubling questions. Was the family really to blame for the other disappearances, or was the connection just a coincidence? And had the disappearances stopped for completely different reasons? There was no way to be sure, and this lack of certainty made everyone involved less sure of themselves. People were cautiously hopeful as the year 1900 began. The new century promised progress, with science winning out over superstition. Authorities hoped that the family would eventually adapt to modern life and give up their strange customs in favor of a more normal way of life. This hope turned out to be very naive. A particularly bad snowstorm that year cut off the mountainous area completely. For weeks, the trails were impossible. The outpost couldn't get any supplies or talk to anyone. The guards had to make do with what they had on hand, carefully rationing it until the weather got better. During this forced isolation, they saw something that made no sense at all. That season's coldest night, when the temperature dropped so low that breath froze in the air right away, they saw family members walking through the deep snow with no shoes on and only their thin, patched clothes on. They didn't seem to be bothered by the deadly cold. They moved with a clear goal in mind, carrying things that couldn't be seen from a distance and then disappearing into the forest covered in white. The guards talked about whether or not they should step in, offer help, or warn about the dangers of being outside for too long. But something stopped them. There was something about the way that family moved that made it clear they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't victims of the storm. They were part of something that went beyond what the human body can normally do. The rangers told what they had seen when the trails were open again after winter. Doctors who were asked were not sure. They said that no one could survive those temperatures without proper protection, let alone walk for hours in deep snow without getting frostbite or hypothermia. But all of the rangers agreed on what they saw. There was no room for error or interpretation. Anthropologists started to wonder what kinds of physical changes might have happened over the years due to extreme isolation. That lineage may have evolved in subtle ways, gaining strange ways of dealing with problems in their environment. People who needed scientific explanations found this theory comforting, but there was something about it that didn't quite fit. They always felt that the truth was much stranger and less comfortable than any academic theory could handle. The start of the new century brought big changes to the Appalachian region. Industrialization was moving quickly, lumber companies were growing, and railroads were starting to reach places that had been thought to be impossible to get to before. Progress was going to happen, and with it came the need to bring even the most remote parts of North Carolina up to date. But the Mountain family stayed an oddity, a remnant of something that wouldn't fade away with time. In 1901, a reporter from Asheville decided to look into the case very carefully. He was known for being brave in his reporting and going where others were afraid to go. He spent weeks talking to people in the area, gathering stories and sorting out the facts from the folklore. He wanted to write a series of articles that would finally reveal the truth about the strange family, bringing reason to a topic that was clouded by fear and superstition. The journalist got special permission to spend a week with the guards, closely watching how the family went about their daily lives. He brought the latest camera gear, notebooks full of prepared questions, and an unshakable desire to record everything in great detail. His observations didn't show anything really unusual during the first few days. The family went on with their strange but harmless lives, completely ignoring him. The journalist did something brave on the third day. He went straight to the patriarch and tried to start a conversation by giving him gifts. The old man politely accepted the things that were offered, but he didn't want to talk. When the journalist kept asking questions about the family's history, where it came from, and what it believed, all he got were blank stares and stubborn silence. It was as pointless and frustrating as trying to get confessions from old stones. But that night, things changed. One of the guards woke up the journalist and pointed to the forest with a worried look on his face. Family members were gathered in the ritual circle that had been found years before. It was a cleared area where ancestral fires had burned for decades. They made a specific pattern, with each one placed at exact intervals around the edge. This time, there was no fire, just the bodies lying still in the dim starlight. The journalist tried to get closer to see better, but the guards held him back. They knew the unspoken rules that they shouldn't break. They stayed at their post and watched through binoculars. The family stayed in that circle for hours without moving. They didn't move or sing. They were like living statues, just there. They then quietly left, going back to their homes as if nothing had happened, as the first light of dawn began to turn the sky gray. The journalist was very upset by what happened. When his articles were finally published, they sounded very different from what he had planned. Instead of clear explanations, they turned into restless thoughts about the limits of what people can know, and about communities that are so far outside of normality that they can't be put into any one category. He said out loud that he didn't have any answers, just a growing list of questions that were getting harder to answer. The articles brought the case back into the public eye, but they also made people tired of it. People were sick of the mystery that had not been solved and the fact that the authorities couldn't give them good answers. People started to speak up, saying that the family should be left alone, that the mountains should be off limits, and that everyone should stop wasting money on endless surveillance. What was the real problem now that the disappearances had stopped? Why not let those people live in a strange way all by themselves? This more open-minded view became more popular, especially among younger people who didn't have the same fears that older people did. There were serious talks in 1902 about cutting back on surveillance, and maybe even taking down the outpost completely. The operation cost a lot of money, and the guards kept asking to be moved to other posts that weren't as isolated. The practical benefits seemed to be getting less and less clear. But before any choice could be made, something happened that brought back all of the worries that had come before. While mapping mineral deposits in the area for a mining company, a geologist found something amazing. He found carvings on the walls of a deep cave hidden behind thick plants. These were not natural markings left by water or time, but carvings that were exactly like the ones that had been found around the family clearing. The cave went down a long way and had tunnels that looked like they had been changed by people. The geologist, who was both a scientist and brave, went as deep as his lamp would let him. The walls were covered with those symbols, one on top of the other, as if people had been adding their own marks for hundreds of years. There were also things left in natural crevices in the rock, like primitive tools, clay pots, and what looked like fabric that had been preserved by the dry conditions underground. As soon as he told people about his find, teams of archaeologists were put together. Finally, there was a chance to learn about that family's history through real evidence, not just what they saw on the surface. The digs started with a lot of scientific excitement, and each artifact that was found was carefully cleaned. They took a lot of pictures of the symbols and compared them to records from known ancient cultures. The results were very confusing. The artifacts looked like they came from very different times. Some were clearly new, made with materials and techniques from the 19th century. Some of the symbols looked much older, maybe even hundreds of years old, but they all had the same ones, which suggests that culture has stayed the same over very long periods of time. How could one family keep the same traditions for so long, living on the edges of recorded history? Excavations in the cave showed that people had lived there in layers that didn't fit with any known timeline for the area. Archaeologists were getting more and more confused as they recorded finds that didn't fit into any known historical story. There were chipped stone tools that looked like they were from a long time ago, but there were also things that were clearly from more recent times. It was as if that cave had been a safe place for a tradition that had lasted for hundreds of years without changing, thanks to a family that refused to change or adapt. The patterns on the walls were the most interesting part. The carvings looked older and more detailed the deeper they went into the cave. In the deepest chambers, they found drawings that looked like they were mapping constellations, but the way they were arranged didn't match the night sky of any known time. There were geometric diagrams that were surprisingly complicated, with spirals that were perfectly intertwined and suggested a deep understanding of symmetry and proportions. How could people who lived in such simple conditions have made something so advanced? One of the archaeologists who studies pre-Columbian cultures put forward a controversial idea. Maybe that family came from an ancient civilization that lived in the mountains long before Europeans came to the area. This civilization may have chosen to keep their customs in their purest form, rejecting any outside influence over the years. The theory was appealing in its simplicity, but there were evident problems. There were no records of any advanced civilization in that specific region of the Appalachian, and even if one had existed, how to explain the persistence of such unaltered traditions through so many centuries of dramatic change around them? The news about the cave discoveries spread quickly, and schools all over the country became interested. Researchers from well-known universities went to North Carolina to see the results for themselves. There were heated arguments in scientific journals, with each expert giving a different explanation based on their own field of study. Linguists tried to figure out what the symbols meant, geologists dated the rock formations, and anthropologists made models of how a culture that was so isolated could have grown and survived. But while the scholars argued in their comfortable circles, things were changing in the mountains. The family seemed to know about the digging in their holy cave. The outpost guards reported subtle changes in behavior. There was more movement at night, more gatherings in the ritual circle, a growing intensity in activities they couldn't fully comprehend. The patriarch, who had always maintained a detached, indifferent posture, now frequently glanced in the direction of the cave, his expression impenetrable yet somehow laden with meaning. On a spring morning in 1903, archaeologists working in the cave found something that would completely change the nature of the investigation. In the deepest chamber ever explored, hidden behind a narrow passage that required crawling through meters of damp rock, they discovered a large space that had clearly served a ceremonial purpose. The walls were completely covered in symbols, but these were different from those found in the upper chambers. More elaborate, more densely grouped, forming visual narratives that seemed to tell stories. And at the center of this chamber, something that made even the most skeptical researchers reconsider their certainties. A carefully constructed stone structure that seemed to serve as an altar or focal point. Around it, arranged in precise patterns, were objects that shouldn't be there. Fragments of metal worked with techniques that seemed too advanced for the time suggested by the dating of the geological layers. Fabrics preserved in an almost impossibly simple way, maintaining vibrant colors despite their apparent extreme antiquity, and most disturbingly organic remains that preliminary analyses suggested were centuries, perhaps millennia old. The discovery generated immediate controversy. How could those materials have lasted so long in conditions that were safe but still had humidity and natural decomposition? Was there something in that chamber that preserved things beyond what natural law should allow? The more pragmatic scientists suggested that the datings were wrong, that there was contamination in the samples, that procedures needed to be reviewed. But the more tests they carried out, the more the impossible dates were confirmed. Meanwhile, the family in the mountains grew increasingly agitated. They showed something that could be seen as emotion for the first time since the surveillance started. Not anger or fear, but a deep sense of unease. They met more often, and their talks in that strange language became more lively and important. The guards began to feel a growing discomfort, a sense that something was about to happen, an imminent change they couldn't foresee, but could feel approaching like an invisible storm. A recent graduate anthropologist with progressive ideas about how to interact with other cultures was one of the younger researchers who decided to try something new. He suggested that instead of just studying the things that were taken out of the cave, he should talk to the family directly, show them what he found, and ask them what it meant. It was a risky move that could have upset people whose sacred space had been invaded, but he said that without the practitioner's cultural knowledge, they would never really understand those symbols and rituals. He got permission from the authorities, but only after being careful. He was with armed guards and a translator who knew how to speak Appalachian dialects that were not widely spoken. He climbed up to the clearing with pictures of the cave's symbols and carefully drawn pictures of the most complicated patterns. The family watched them come up with that quiet, focused look that was so typical of them. The anthropologist gave the patriarch the pictures, and he took them slowly, looking at each one with such intensity that his hand shook a little. The next thing that happened was completely unexpected. The old man's eyes suddenly looked a lot younger and more awake than they had before. And then, for the first time since they had been found, he spoke in clear, understandable English. There was no sign of the strange dialect they always used. His voice was low but strong, and he chose each word carefully. He said that those symbols weren't meant for outsiders, and that they stood for knowledge that should stay hidden. He also said that by bringing them to light in the modern world, the researchers had let loose something they couldn't control. The anthropologist was shocked. All of their previous attempts to talk had failed, and now this perfect articulation. He tried to ask questions and get more information, but the patriarch just shook his head. He gave back the pictures and walked away, which meant that the conversation was over. The other family members started to move, as if they were getting ready for something. It looked like they had already made a decision and planned their movements ahead of time. The guards saw the family do the most complicated ritual they had ever seen that night. All the people who were there formed a circle. But this time they brought things from the cave that they had clearly secretly taken before the excavation started. These things looked like they made a kind of map or diagram when they were arranged in certain ways around the edge. Then they started to sing, but not the strange tunes they had been singing before. These were different, older, and made the air feel like it was vibrating. The guards could tell that something was different. Even though it was spring, the temperature dropped a lot. It looked like the starlight was bending above the circle, as if reality itself were bending around that space. The trees around them, which had been there for generations and were now silent giants, started to sway without any wind. Their leaves whispered in time with the chants. It was an experience that went beyond what scientists could see, something that reached deep into the mind, where fear from the past still lived. The circle was empty when the sun came up. The whole family was gone. There were no tracks on the trails and no signs of departure. They were just gone. The houses were still standing, and the things inside them were still where they belonged, but there was no sign of people. It was as if they had disappeared into the air of the mountains, going back to some strange place where they might have come from in the first place. The guards ran down to bring the impossible news, and in the weeks that followed, no one from that strange family would be seen again, even after a lot of searching in the area. The family's disappearance shook people up all over the world, not just in the mountains of North Carolina. Authorities set up the biggest search operation ever in that area, with dozens of men searching every valley, cave, and forgotten trail. They brought in hunting dogs to follow tracks that always led to random places, as if the people had just stopped existing in certain parts of the forest. It didn't make sense, but the evidence pointed to it being true. The guards who saw what happened last night were questioned over and over again, and their stories were picked apart for inconsistencies or exaggerations. However, they all stuck to the same story, with details that matched perfectly between independent testimonies. There was no way to say that they all made it up, not when their faces still showed how much they had seen. Something strange had happened in that ritual circle that couldn't be explained by normal means. The scientists who were digging in the caves were asked to share their thoughts. Maybe the symbols and patterns held some clues that could explain where the family had gone or how they had managed to disappear so completely. But the researchers were just as confused as everyone else. Their research had shown that things were complicated, old, and passed down through generations, but nothing that suggested the ability to just disappear without a trace. A theory gained popularity among people who lived there, especially older people who remembered the stories their grandparents told them. They said that the Appalachian Mountains were much older than any human civilization, and that they had seen things happen before history was written down. These stories say that there were places in the mountains where the line between the known world and something else was thinner. People could cross over if they knew the right secrets and did the right things. This interpretation says that the family had just gone back to where they had come from in the first place. It was a rural superstition and folklore, the kind of thinking that should have died out in the modern world. But without any logical explanations, even smart people started to think about things they would have never thought about before. The case was so strange that it made people think outside of what they normally would have thought. The search was officially called off in 1904. There was no more searching to do and no new leads to follow. It was as if the family had never existed. They had completely disappeared. The outpost was taken down. The guards were moved to other places, and life in the area slowly started to get back to normal. But the mystery stayed, like an open wound in the community's mind that couldn't be easily healed or forgotten. The artifacts found in the cave were sent to different schools, each hoping to learn more about them through careful study. For decades, scholars from many generations would devote their lives to trying to figure out those symbols, those patterns, and that culture that was impossible to understand. Some discoveries were made, and understanding got a little better, but the big picture was still broken and missing pieces. There were important pieces of the puzzle that just couldn't be found. The family had lost their knowledge. For years, the clearing in the mountains stayed the same. Nobody wanted to build there or farm that land. People kept saying that the place still had a mark on it, and that it still belonged to the strange people who had lived there for so long. People who passed through the area from time to time said they felt strange things, like being watched or hearing sounds they couldn't place. Nothing solid, nothing that could be proven by science, just that gut feeling that made people hurry up. Eventually, the newspapers stopped writing about the case. There were just too many ways to tell the same mystery that wasn't solved. The public lost interest and focused on more important things, like the technological changes that were changing the country and the political issues that seemed more important. The Appalachian family became a footnote in regional history. People were interested in them from time to time, but they were rarely studied in depth. But for those who had been directly involved, the guards, the investigators, and the residents who had felt the weight of that strange presence in the mountains, forgetting was not possible. They would carry the memories with them for the rest of their lives and tell their children and grandchildren about them, but they always knew that their words could never fully capture what really happened. There was something about those events that didn't fit into a story and was always just out of reach of words. In the middle of the 20th century, when the area had changed completely, with paved roads cutting through the mountains and tourists visiting national parks where there had once been only thick jungle, strange reports would sometimes come up. People who hiked on remote trails said they found symbols carved into old trees. These marks didn't look like any modern vandalism, but they did look like patterns that were recorded at the beginning of the century. They were probably just coincidences, since people are good at seeing patterns where there aren't any, but there was always that little doubt, that quiet thought that maybe, just maybe, the story hadn't completely ended that spring morning when the family went missing. Eventually, the cave was closed to the public because it was thought to be unsafe because of its unstable structure. However, some brave explorers still found ways to get in, using modern flashlights to explore the deep chambers, taking pictures of the symbols on the walls, and trying to feel some echo of that ancient presence. Most of the time, their unauthorized trips ended in disappointment. The cave was just a cave. It was dark and rocky. All the magic that might have been there was gone with the people who knew how to use it. And yet, on the darkest nights, when the moon was gone and the mountains were completely dark, people in the area sometimes saw lights high above. These weren't the lights of campsites or the lanterns of lost hikers. They were the greenish lights that had been seen so many years before, moving among the trees for no apparent reason and dancing in ways that seemed to mean something to people who couldn't see them. People didn't pay much attention to these reports. They were ghost stories and local legends that people told to keep the mystery alive in every area. Years turned into decades, and the story of the Appalachian family became a part of the stories that people in the area tell. But in 1947, something happened that brought that almost forgotten story back to life. A history professor at the University of North Carolina found documents that had been filed incorrectly and not cataloged for decades, while looking through county archives for a project on Appalachian communities that were cut off from the rest of the world. These were the full records of the first investigations, with photos that had never been published and witness statements that had been kept secret at the time because they were too sensitive. One of the outpost guards kept a diary during the months leading up to the family's disappearance, and he found it to be very interesting. The first few entries were just normal, boring things like the weather, how boring the watch was, and small complaints about the food and being alone. But the tone changed a lot as the pages turned. The guard started writing down the scary dreams that kept him up at night. In these dreams, he walked through the mountains and saw impossible structures, entire cities hidden in valleys that shouldn't exist, and people who spoke without moving their lips and shared knowledge that he couldn't remember when he was awake. What was most disturbing was that other guards wrote about similar things in their reports. It wasn't just one man who was lonely and had an overactive imagination. There were multiple independent people reporting the same things. They talked about these dreams and tried to figure out what was going on. Maybe it was something in the water they drank, or maybe it was something natural in the mountains that made them all see things that weren't there. Or maybe it was just the fact that that strange family was there and lived in such a different way that it spread to the people who watched them for a long time. The professor was very interested. He chose to do his own research by going to the places mentioned in the papers and talking to the descendants of the people who were involved in the original case. Even though many of the main characters had died, their children and grandchildren kept telling the stories that had been passed down through the years. These stories, though they varied in detail, all had the same main elements: the strange family living an impossible life, the strange things that happened, and the disappearance that made no sense. The professor found out that the clearing in the mountains was still there during his research, even though the forest had grown a lot and taken back the space that had been kept clear for decades. He put together a trip and brought students and equipment for recording. When they finally got to the site, they saw that the simple buildings had completely fallen down and returned to the ground where they had come from. However, the ritual circle was still there. a circular dip in the ground where nothing grew, as if the land had been changed in some way that would last forever. At first, the students, practical young people from the time after World War II, saw everything as a historical curiosity, an interesting story that could be explained by science and reason. They set up camp near the clearing and planned to spend a few days taking pictures of the area, collecting soil samples and making maps of the surrounding areas. But on the first night, they started to doubt what they knew. After the sun went down, the mood changed a lot. The forest's silence became heavy, like a stillness that wasn't just the lack of sound, but something more active and present. One of the students, a young man who had been skeptical and made fun of the stories during the trip, swore he saw figures moving among the trees around the camp. They weren't animals. They were humanoid shapes that appeared briefly on the edge of the campfire light before disappearing into the dark. At first, his co-workers thought it was just nerves and suggestion. But as the night went on, more and more people started to have similar experiences. Feelings of being watched, the impression of invisible beings moving around the camp's edge, and sounds that sounded almost like words in the strange dialect described in the old documents. The professor tried to stay scientific by explaining each event through natural causes. For example, the human brain was programmed to look for patterns and see ambiguous stimuli as possible threats in a new environment, especially after spending days reading disturbing stories. It was perfectly normal for his expectations to affect how he saw things. But he couldn't completely deny the discomfort he felt, that primal feeling that something was very wrong with that place. The next morning, they found something that had never been mentioned in any of the historical records. They followed a trail that was almost invisible from the ritual circle and found another cave chamber. It was smaller than the main one, but it was clear that it was part of the same system. The walls here were covered not with the ancient symbols, but with something more recent. Charcoal drawings depicting scenes that seemed like narratives, human figures in circular formations, star patterns, and curiously representations of what appeared to be the mountains themselves, seen from an impossible perspective, as if drawn by someone observing from a great height in the sky. They took extensive photographs and collected charcoal samples for dating. Later results showed that the markings were probably made in the early 1900s, maybe a few years before the family went missing. It was like they had left behind a final record, a message for the next people. But if it was a message, its meaning was still unclear. In the decades that followed, scholars who looked at the pictures would suggest dozens of different meanings, none of which were certain or possible. In 1949, the professor published his findings in an academic paper that sparked a lot of discussion. Some co-workers praised how carefully he did the research, how he found a story that was almost lost, and how he presented evidence that needed to be studied further. Some people said he was too trusting, and that he had been seduced by the case's mysteriousness and lost the scientific objectivity he needed. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, as it usually is. It was clear that the case held a strange interest for those who studied it closely. That story just wouldn't end. It kept raising new questions even after years of looking into it. And it wasn't just academic fascination. Ordinary people, locals, tourists who heard the stories, all felt that strange attraction, that need to understand what had really happened in those mountains at the beginning of the century. During the 50s and 60s, as America underwent profound cultural transformations, interest in unexplained mysteries grew significantly. The Appalachian family case was rediscovered by a new generation, this time through different lenses. Some interpreted it as evidence of alternate dimensions, others as proof of lost ancestral knowledge. Some people even said that there were links between the people who lived there and visitors from other worlds, but most serious researchers did not believe this theory. Eventually, the state park took over the area around the clearing. There were signs put up that told the story in a sanitized way, leaving out the most disturbing parts and focusing on cultural isolation and how people adapt to extreme environments. People who were tourists sometimes came by, took pictures, and said how beautiful the mountains were. Most people didn't know about the deeper parts of the story, like the disappearances, the rituals, and the strange events that had scared people in the past. But people who went off the beaten path and into the most remote areas sometimes came back with strange stories. They saw symbols carved into trees that weren't on official maps, circular clearings where nothing grew, and dots scattered across the mountains in some invisible pattern. And that feeling of being watched by eyes that never fully showed themselves. In 1973, a filmmaker who wasn't connected to the case tried to make a movie about it. He spent months in the area, talking to people who had lived there for a long time, filming historical sites, and trying to capture the feel of the mountains. The documentary was never finished. The filmmaker suddenly stopped working on the project and wouldn't say why. Years later, in an interview with a little-known magazine, he would only say that he had seen things while filming that made him question his own sanity and that there were limits to how far human curiosity should go. The unfinished documentary's archives were eventually given to a university, where they sat untouched for decades. Researchers found hours of unedited footage when they finally digitized them in the early 21st century. Most of it was normal stuff, like regular interviews and pictures of mountains. But there were strange scenes filmed at night where the camera caught things that the human eye shouldn't be able to see. Light patterns that moved in strange ways, shadows that looked like they had their own depth and substance, and in one very unsettling scene, what looked like humanoid figures in the background of the scene, watching the film crew with complete stillness before disappearing in the next frame. Technicians looked at the footage for signs of tampering or camera problems that could explain the strange things that happened. They didn't find anything that proved anything. The pictures were real, and the camera recorded them exactly as they appeared on the tape. Whatever they had caught had really been there that night in the Appalachian Mountains, quietly watching as strangers tried to figure out secrets that maybe should never be told. And so, we have reached the end of our journey through the Appalachian Mountains' shadows, where a mysterious lineage lived on the edges of the known world, keeping secrets that were beyond what most people could understand. This story reminds us that there are places where reality seems less solid, where the unexplainable can exist, even in a world that wants to understand and catalog every mystery. The mountains are still quiet witnesses to everything that happened on their steep slopes and in their deep valleys. The clearing is still there, but it's hidden under layers of plants that are trying to take it back. The ritual circle, where the family did their strange rituals, is still a permanent scar on the land. And on nights when the moon isn't out, when the darkness is complete and the silence is heavy on the old trees, there are still people who swear they feel something different in the air, a presence that never really left. We will never know for sure what really happened that spring morning when the family went missing. We will never fully understand the messages they left carved into stone and wood. They were from a culture that lived alongside known civilization. Maybe that's the real point of some mysteries. They aren't meant to be solved, but to remind us that we can never fully understand the world because we can only see and process so much. The story of the Appalachian family is not just a historical curiosity, it is something deeper that echoes through time. It touches that deep part of us that still remembers when the world was bigger, wilder, and full of possibilities that were hard to explain. In our time of satellites and instant communication, when every part of the world has been mapped and photographed, stories like this one remind us that there may still be places that we don't fully understand, places where the unknown still exists. The symbols in the caves still don't have a clear translation. The patterns the family followed in their activities are still unclear. The lights that danced among the trees have never been fully explained, and the disappearance itself, that last act of complete dissolution, is still the main mystery around which all the other questions revolve without finding a center. There is something poetically right about this. A family line that lived in secret for so long, protected its privacy with all its might, and refused to be integrated or explained, finally leaving in a way that made it impossible to truly understand or categorize them. They stayed a mystery until the end and beyond. People who want to find the strange and mysterious still go to the Appalachian Mountains. Hikers go down forgotten trails. Explorers look for caves that haven't been mapped yet. And sometimes someone comes back with a story about something they saw or felt that they can't fully explain. Maybe these are just thoughts that come from minds that have been shaped by old stories. Or maybe the mountains really do hold secrets that they don't want anyone to find out about. This story makes us think about how many other families, communities, and ways of life may have existed on the edges of recorded history. How many lives were lived and lost without leaving a trace in official records, and how many people who kept the records of civilization didn't even notice them. The Appalachian family was unique in that they were found, documented, and studied. But how many others were never found and lived strange lives in complete isolation, or vanished without anyone ever knowing they had been there? And so we end this look into one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases the mountains have ever seen. It is a story of extreme isolation, of traditions that have been passed down through generations, of a way of life that went against all modern logic, and of a story that leaves us with more questions than answers and more mystery than certainty. And maybe that's how it should be. The Appalachian Mountains are still there, always there, keeping their secrets hidden under layers of mist and thick forest. And maybe the echoes of that mysterious family still live on in those forgotten heights, not in documents or pictures, but in the very essence of that old, unchanging place. Some stories never really end. They just become part of the landscape that made them, adding to the mystery that surrounds the places where the known meets the unknown.